1555. That's 1-800-417-1555.
Of darkness, and just before dusk fell, there was a fair amount, not I would say an excessive amount, but a fair amount of movements of Serb paramilitary units, police units, and Yugoslav military units. So that was happening as the day unfolded. I'm hearing automatic gunfire in the distance. Let me just pause so I can hear and stick my head out further from my vantage point to see if I can see anything. Now I'm seeing an ambulance disappearing with a blue light flashing in the distance from the direction of where I heard some gunfire. But that did not sound like anti-aircraft fire. That sounded more like small arms fire, so it's difficult to assess, obviously, what is going on. And as far as any missile activity, cruise missile activity, I'm well acquainted with what happens during cruise missile strikes from my experiences in Baghdad over the years, and I'm not seeing any missile activity over Pristina as things stand now.
The residents of Kosovo, Brent, has there been an evacuation of any extent of the city of Pristina?
No, we were out and about in the city today, and people were mostly going about filling up with supplies, stocking up on bread, candles, flour, sugar, when they can get hold of it, and so forth. We saw no run on the gas stations here, which runs contrary to what we know was happening in Belgrade, where there were long lines at the gas stations. The city was pretty active today, with people going about pretty routine business in some respects, particularly attending the government-owned stores and outlets and offices. In fact, public transport was still operating. I saw a bus pass by my vantage point within the past hour. There were no passengers on it, but certainly public transport was running. The city's power supplies are maintained. Lights are burning here. The OG car is passing down the main street. I'm just seeing one scene of someone running down the main street. No air raid sirens, certainly in my close proximity, but I can now hear an air raid siren in the distance, far in the distance. You probably can't hear it, but certainly an air raid siren going off now. And within the past 5 minutes or so, we heard several explosions. And in fact, now another air raid siren is winding up, and I'm hearing more gunfire closer to me this time. That again sounded like light, not heavy machine gun fire, so it's difficult to know whether that might be perhaps Serbs firing off their automatic weapons, their hand weapons, Kalashnikovs and so forth, in anger as a symbol of protest towards what's happening here, or whether it's any other sort of hostile intent. Difficult to gauge at the moment. I have a pretty restricted view here, but as I say, air raid sirens going off, automatic gunfire sporadic, and at least three heavy explosions within the past few minutes.
And yes, Brent Sadler, we can hear the sirens that you've been reporting on. Seeing as Brent Sadler in Pristina, and we can tell you that the President of the United States is expected to make a statement within moments. We've been hearing of an imminent NATO airstrike, the first time in its 50-year history that the military action would be an offensive action and against a sovereign country. We do not know for certain, though, if this military action is what Brent Sadler is hearing in Pristina. You're saying, Brent, that it could be any number of things. I imagine explosions around Pristina are not all that unusual.
Well, the kind of explosion I just heard in the city, aside from bomb attacks, which of course have been pretty recurrent here over the past weeks and months, given the circumstances and the expectations of NATO airstrikes here, that was a pretty loud explosion, but it could well have been some sort of a bombing incident. It's difficult to say, impossible to say, but given experiences of airstrikes in the past, certainly my experiences in Baghdad, we're not seeing anything like any anti-aircraft fire, any ground air defenses firing missiles from our vantage point, but I must stress that I'm in the city. And the kind of targets that one would assume that NATO is going to be going for would not necessarily be in the heart of a heavily populated areas, where it would be difficult even with smart weapons to take out military targets without the risk of collateral civilian damage. It's not very far, however, to the city limits and beyond, where one can see it's literally a 20-minute drive to where we certainly saw earlier today movements of Yugoslav heavy weaponry moving away from, we understood, from areas where there have been clashes between the Yugoslav military and the Kosovo Liberation Army rebels, and it was suggested to me by an army officer here that this was a twofold plan. One, to reduce the risk, the visible risk of the exposure of the weaponry to NATO airstrikes, and to reduce the chance for provocative acts, they said, by the KLA terrorists, as the Serbs call them. Certainly throughout the day there was building tension, particularly as the afternoon died out and as these air raid sirens have continued to sound. That has obviously caused tensions to rise. I'm now seeing an army truck passing by my location. It is filled with soldiers. It may well just be on a patrol. In fact, it looks like it's on a city patrol through Pristina, passing in front of me. In fact, another truck as well. But certainly no signs of any panic by those armed units which are passing me by. And we, of course, at this stage have no confirmation from any Serb or Yugoslav officials as to what those explosions were and whether or not NATO airstrikes have actually begun in earnest.
All right, Brent Sadler, we'll get back to you. Brent Sadler at his post in Pristina, which is the provincial capital of Kosovo. We have correspondents at all points in order to cover all aspects of this story, and we'll be getting to them all as we continue to watch developments. But right now we're going to check in with Chief International Correspondent Christian Amanpour, who is in Belgrade, the capital of Yugoslavia. Christian, what's happening there, if anything?
Oh, yes, Lou. In fact, just as Brent Sadler was reporting what he was hearing in Kosovo, we too here in Belgrade saw two big flashes on the horizon. It appeared to be going on at almost exactly the time that it was going on in Kosovo as well. Here we have not heard any explosion, but we have seen two orange flashes light up in the distant horizon, almost beyond the city lights. We do not know, we cannot confirm to you exactly what those two may have been in terms of what they may have been hitting, but sources do tell us that there is a military base near Belgrade, and indeed some say that there are anti-aircraft positions around here as well. Now, it doesn't look like any kind of massive bombardment, as Brent was saying. It is not at all the same sort of situation that we saw in Baghdad over the last few months, and indeed the entire city is still illuminated. The lights are on. People are still in the streets. It's light traffic, but there are people in the streets. As we've been reporting today, tension amongst the people has been rising gradually throughout the day as it became inevitable, they say, that something like this was going to happen. People have been stockpiling on gasoline, stockpiling on food and water and candles, and indeed the government itself on morning television and throughout the day has been broadcasting civil defense drills. So all we can say now is that we have seen two orange flashes in two different locations on the city's horizon here in the last few moments. Lou?
All right, Christian Amanpour in Belgrade, and we're about to get some action at the White House. Here's Natalie Allen.
Lou, we're hearing that CNN's Wolf Blitzer has news from the White House about whether this strike is underway. Wolf, what do you know?
That we have been hearing from our correspondents in Kosovo as well as in Yugoslavia proper, in Serbia and Belgrade. Part of this activity, Mr. Clinton, the President of the United States, will be in the briefing room in the next few minutes to make the formal announcement that the NATO airstrikes have started, that the cruise missiles have been launched and are going after the initial wave of targets. We had been told earlier those targets would be the targets that are of potentially greatest danger to the NATO pilots, namely surface-to-air missile batteries, radar equipment, command and control facilities. Once again, CNN is now able to confirm that the NATO airstrikes against Yugoslav positions have begun. Mr. Clinton will make the formal announcement within the next several minutes from the White House briefing room. Natalie?
And Wolf, once the president speaks and this strike is underway, where then will most of the reporters get the information on how this strike is going and what exactly is going on? Will it still be coming from the White House at that point?
There will be information coming from the White House, from the Pentagon, from the State Department, elsewhere in Washington. But the main information, the official information about this military campaign will come from NATO headquarters in Brussels. This, after all, is a NATO operation. This is not simply a U.S. operation or a British operation, although U.S. and British fighter pilots will be the backbone of this operation. It will be a NATO operation under the command of the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, General Wesley Clark. The briefings, we're told, will come from General Clark's operation at NATO headquarters in Brussels, since this is, after all, a NATO operation. But as always is the case, we'll be getting separate information involving the U.S. participation in this NATO air campaign from officials here at the White House, as well as across the river at the Pentagon, the State Department, and elsewhere here in Washington.
Wolf Blitzer at the White House will stay in close contact with you. Again, as Wolf reported, the president will be stepping into the briefing room to make this airstrike official, that it's underway. We expect a 5-minute address to the American people from President Clinton. Will bring his comments to you live, that in just a few moments. Now over to Lou.
The first indications of the NATO air campaign came from Pristina, from CNN's Brent Sadler, who reported the explosions there. And now there's a new development. Brent?
Yes, indeed, Lou. It was several minutes ago that we heard the first explosions. We do not know what those explosive impacts were, but I can tell you that within the past 60 seconds, the entire city has now gone into darkness, blackout conditions. That happened just after those explosions, which we first reported. There are the odd vehicle moving around the city now. I'm seeing sparkles of headlights as vehicles, civilian vehicles, as well as military vehicles, moving about the city. It is an extraordinarily eerie scene here. The air raid sirens were sounding for a time, but they have gone silent. And as I say, the city is in virtual darkness now, blackout conditions, in anticipation of further airstrike activity.
Were there any preparations earlier in the day, as in Belgrade, Brent, as to emergency preparations for a pending air campaign by NATO?
Not really, no. We saw that there were increased levels of security. Armored personnel carriers by the police were deployed in central Pristina there to guard, we were told, important government installations and military barracks, military headquarters. As far as the civilian population is concerned, we saw no real panic levels. We saw people getting jittery when the air raid sirens first sounded off mid-afternoon. We did see a lot of people buying bread and milk and essential provisions to stock up, and also we saw one or two shops shuttering up windows, trying to protect any glass damage, but there certainly wasn't any widespread preparations for what seems to be unfolding tonight. And in terms of what goes on through the night, it's going to be difficult to assess. Certainly, we have limited access to going out on the streets. That is not regarded as a prudent thing to do given the circumstances and given the very high anger levels by Serbs in Kosovo, who feel that NATO airstrikes to force their leadership in Belgrade to accept the Kosovo peace deal that was signed in Paris last week is unjust and unacceptable. On the other side of the divide, the ethnic Albanians, on the other hand, say that this is a long overdue and a welcome intervention, that they have signed, their leaders signed the peace accords in Paris and did not see the opponents on the other side of the negotiating deal sign up. So they are anxious to see NATO intervention take its effect and to force the Yugoslav authorities to sign that Kosovo peace deal. But on the other hand, the Serbs are showing, from my experiences over the past few weeks and months, both in Belgrade
Brent,
and the Serb community here in Kosovo, that they are showing great unity against what they say is NATO aggression.
All right, Brent, we'll have to interrupt. We're going to go to Washington now. Here's Judy Woodruff.
Lou, we are going to go directly to the White House, in fact, where, as you reported, as we heard from Wolf Blitzer just a moment ago, President Clinton himself will speak to the nation, speak before the television cameras to announce officially that these air attacks by NATO, led by U.S. Forces, are underway. At the same time, the word was coming out here in Washington. Word was coming from the head of NATO, Javier Solana, who is the NATO Secretary General, was making the announcement virtually simultaneously. Let's go to the White House now. CNN's John King. John.
Judy, the president due here in the briefing room in a little more than a minute. Officials telling CNN he has been in the Oval Office preparing his remarks to lay out his rationale for these U.S.-led NATO airstrikes. The president also on the phone the past 90 minutes with congressional leaders, telling them the attacks were imminent, explaining again his rationale. We're told at least 2 of those leaders told the president they were prepared to speak out in support of the troops, but also urged him to do a better job of explaining to the American people why he thought this operation was necessary and so critical. The president, we're told, promised them at that time that he planned to do so. The president, as I said, due here in the White House briefing room. Earlier today, he had a conversation with Boris Yeltsin explaining why the United States wanted to go forward with this over Russian objections. Judy?
And John, the White House seems, all right, I understand the president is stepping into the briefing room. We're going to bring you that picture just as soon as we have it. This again, the press briefing room in the West Wing of the White House. We were told just about 7 or 8 minutes ago that President Clinton himself wanted to make the announcement to the American people that these NATO airstrikes are underway. These are strikes that are led by U.S. military forces,
Ladies and gentlemen,
but they do involve other nations
of the United
as well.
States.
Good afternoon. United States forces, acting with our NATO allies, have commenced airstrikes against Serbian military targets in the former Yugoslavia. I will address the nation more fully tonight on why this action is necessary, but I wanted to say a few words now. We and our NATO allies have taken this action only after extensive and repeated efforts to obtain a peaceful solution to the crisis in Kosovo. But President Milosevic, who over the past decade started the terrible wars against Croatia and Bosnia, has again chosen aggression over peace. He has violated the commitments he himself made last fall to stop the brutal repression in Kosovo. He has rejected the balanced and fair peace accords that our allies and partners, including Russia, proposed last month, a peace agreement that Kosovo's ethnic Albanians courageously accepted. Instead, his forces have intensified their attacks, burning down Kosovar Albanian villages and murdering civilians. As I speak, more Serb forces are moving into Kosovo, and more people are fleeing their homes. 60,000 in just the last 5 weeks, 250,000 altogether. Many have headed toward neighboring countries. Kosovo's crisis now is full-blown, and if we do not act, clearly it will get even worse. Only firmness now can prevent greater catastrophe later. Our strikes have 3 objectives. First, to demonstrate the seriousness of NATO's opposition to aggression and its support for peace. Second, to deter President Milosevic from continuing and escalating his attacks on helpless civilians by imposing a price for those attacks. And third, if necessary, to damage Serbia's capacity to wage war against Kosovo in the future by seriously diminishing its military capabilities. As I have repeatedly said to the American people, this action is not risk-free. It carries risks. And I ask for the prayers of all Americans for our men and women in uniform in the area. However, I have concluded that the dangers of acting now are clearly outweighed by the risks of failing to act. The risks that many more innocent people will die or be driven from their homes by the tens of thousands. The risks that the conflict will involve and destabilize neighboring nations. It will clearly be much more costly and dangerous to stop later than this effort to prevent it from going further now. At the end of the 20th century, after 2 world wars and a Cold War, we and our allies have a chance to leave our children a Europe that is free, peaceful, and stable. But we must act now to do that. Because if the Balkans once again become a place of brutal killing and massive refugee flights, it will be impossible to achieve. With our allies, we use diplomacy and force to end the war in Bosnia. Now trouble next door in Kosovo puts the region's people at risks again. Our NATO allies unanimously support this action. The United States must stand with them and stand against ethnic violence and atrocity. Our alliance is united, and I am particularly grateful for the support we have received from members of Congress from both parties. As we go forward, I will remain in close contact with Congress. I have spoken with all the leaders today and in contact with our friends and allies around the world. And I will have more to say about all of this tonight. Thank you.
Mr. President, what do you ask of Milosevic?
President Clinton speaking at the White House very briefly, as you heard, in effect saying that the risks are there, but the United States believes that the risk posed by Slobodan Milosevic and the Yugoslav forces against the civilians of Kosovo, 250,000 of whom, he said, have already been displaced, 60,000, he said, just in the last 5 weeks. Briefly, he said the objectives are, again, to demonstrate the seriousness of NATO in its opposition to Serb aggression. Second, to deter Slobodan Milosevic in his continuing attacks against the Kosovo civilians. And finally, he said, if necessary, to damage the Serb capacity to wage war on the Kosovo civilians. These are many of the objectives we've been hearing from the President, from the White House, from the State Department and others over the last few days. The President stressing once again, clearly trying to get across to the American people the importance of this mission, why he is willing to put the lives of American men and women in uniform at risk. The President did say that he will address the subject at greater length tonight. We are told that that address will come at 8 o'clock Eastern. But he did say that he wanted to explain to the American people in this statement that I think ran just about 5 or so minutes just now. President Clinton clearly under a great deal of pressure. He has been criticized for his actions in the Yugoslav arena by opponents, both Democratic and Republican, on Capitol Hill. He's clearly faced criticism in Europe and in particularly recently from the Russians. Now let's go to our chief White House correspondent, Wolf Blitzer. Wolf.
Judy, President Clinton was strongly encouraged by even his closest supporters on Capitol Hill to go ahead and make this case directly to the American people in a nationally televised address this evening. Some of his supporters on Capitol Hill even wanted him to do that last night. Some White House advisors saying they only really thought that the networks, the 3 major television broadcast networks in the United States, would give Mr. Clinton one shot to make that case, and that's why he decided to do it once the NATO airstrikes have commenced. And now we have heard from President Clinton directly that those NATO airstrikes have started. The initial wave, we're told, includes cruise missiles, both seaborne and airborne cruise missiles. Many of those planes that will be involved will be coming from the Aviano NATO air base in Italy. We're seeing some pictures of planes taking off, U.S. and NATO fighter planes taking off from Aviano. The initial wave, though, of the attack was designed, we're told, to go after targets that pose some grave threats to NATO, to targets that pose some grave threats to NATO pilots, air defense systems, command and control systems. The purpose of these NATO airstrikes in the initial wave will be both to punish as well as to deter, but also to protect NATO pilots who will be in the sky, presumably now, at least for the next several hours and perhaps for days, as these airstrikes continue. U.S. officials are going out of their way to make the point that no U.S. ground troops, no NATO ground troops will be engaged. This will be an air campaign designed to achieve those three objectives that Mr. Clinton delineated in his formal remarks just a few minutes ago. Judy?
All right, Wolf Blitzer at the White House. Joining me here in the studio, retired Marine General Richard Neal. General Neal, the president talked about the risks to American soldiers, American troops. In fact, though, as Wolf said, the first wave of these NATO attacks do come in the form of cruise missiles, which are fired from aircraft and ships away from the area. In other words, they're in a safer position. Is that not correct?
Absolutely. The first phase, as we've all anticipated, is that they would fire missiles from the air-launched cruise missiles from the B-52 bombers, perhaps the B-2. We don't know that yet as a proven fact, and then also from the surface ships operating in the Adriatic.
And General Neal, what is the best estimation of how long the cruise missile phase of this operation would last?
Well, I'd be speculating a little bit, Judy, but I think there'll probably be some sense after the first several waves of these cruise missiles, and then they'll be able to have a better feeling as to how successful they've been against the different defensive targets, particularly the command and control. They'll be able to, by intercepts, know if in fact they've been successful.
All right, we've been talking, of course, about what the targets are, and again, without giving anything away, and I know you're talking to what sources that you have at the Pentagon, without giving anything away of a strategic nature, we're looking at the Serb capability to go after aircraft. Is that right? Their defensive capability is what NATO would want to strike, as well as the command and control.
Absolutely. They want to kind of set the conditions for the introduction of U.S. and NATO aircraft. So those conditions are a reduced air defense capability. And they do that by attacking both the missile systems and then those systems that integrate those missile systems, whether they be command and control or whether they be communications nodes.
And these, again, are not just located in Kosovo. Of course, we're talking about Kosovo. That is where much of the activity has taken place. But these defenses and command and control systems are located throughout Yugoslavia. Is that correct?
That's correct. What they probably have done is drawn an arc around Kosovo and said, okay, what's within that arc that we have to take out or to neutralize that will allow us to operate over the Kosovo province area. So they have then selected those targets, and those are the ones that they have been striking.
Now, are these likely to be in populated areas where civilians would be at?
I'm sure there's some, but I'm sure that the targeteers have taken that into consideration, and that as they have drawn up the list and have prioritized what targets they need in order to grant themselves access in, that in fact the NATO planners have sat down and done that, and I would think that they would be very scrupulous in their targeteering to make sure that they try to minimize any collateral damage to civilians.
And just finally, at this point, General Neal, we keep hearing that NATO forces worried about retaliation on the part of the Serbs, that they know that NATO forces are massed in Macedonia to the south of Kosovo. What is the danger to these NATO forces there at this point?
Of course, the Yugoslav forces could, in fact, move into Macedonia. I think that the NATO forces that are there, from all of the folks that I've talked to, are well prepared should that eventuality take place. I think that would probably be foolish for the Yugoslav forces to try that, since that would put them into the open, so to speak, and make them much more vulnerable to air attack.
All right, General Richard Neal, a retired Marine Corps general and retired Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps. Thank you very much, and we will be coming back to you. We're going to take a break, but of course our live coverage of this crisis in Kosovo, as we reported and as President Clinton himself told us just moments ago, NATO airstrikes against the Yugoslav army, the Yugoslav official defenses and command and control has gotten underway within the last half hour. Strikes have been made. We will be reporting on this continuously throughout this day. The President told us that he will be addressing the nation at 8 o'clock tonight Eastern Time. Of course, CNN will carry that live. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, more on this breaking story from Atlanta.